Okay. Okay, hello everybody. My name is Eric Schmitz. I am the former Henry P. Davison IHL Fellow with the American Red Cross's IHL team here at our national headquarters. I say former, but I couldn't stay away from this amazing team, this amazing audience, and especially while we have this incredible guest, which I'm so excited about. But I want to thank all of you for coming today and joining for this really incredible conversation, and this vitally important one. The American Red Cross's IHL program works to educate the public on international humanitarian law and other legal frameworks that touch on armed conflict. And we do this by training volunteer instructors to teach IHL in their communities, and also by providing a stage for webinars. If you're interested in learning more, please contact your regional American Red Cross office to know how you can get involved as a volunteer instructor. And you can also visit our Rules of War blog, and the links to those things are going to be dropped into the chat, so keep an eye out for that. So today our guest, so excited about this, a hero of mine, is Jojo Mehta. Jojo is the executive director, co-founder, and key spokesperson for Stop Ecocide International, which is an incredible organization founded to establish international legal liability for ecocide, and you're going to hear that term a lot today. Jojo founded Stop Ecocide International with the legendary and unfortunately late barrister Holly Higgins. During Jojo's tenure, the movement to make ecocide an international crime has ballooned. It's expanded. The progress has been incredible. It's been remarkable. I've said incredible too many times already, so I'm going to switch it to remarkable. Jojo has had a lifelong career in environmental activism and communications and entrepreneurship. Just an incredible career again with just environmental organizing and campaigning. And today we're going to discuss ecocide, the process of getting it criminalized internationally, and as well as how ecocide and international armed conflict, or just armed conflict in general, kind of interplay with one another and interact and affect each other. After the presentation or the conversation, we're going to have time for some questions, so please throw your questions in the chat, and if we can get to it, I promise that we will. Jojo, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a real pleasure, and that's a very flattering introduction. But it is certainly true that this movement, this initiative, is growing at an incredible rate at the moment. So yeah, absolutely a very exciting time for this.
Oh yes, yeah, it's so wonderful. I just to get us started, could you tell us what ecocide is and why it's so important that it be stopped?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think ecocide is coming to be broadly understood as, a term that covers mass damage and destruction of nature. I can go a little bit more as we go further along this conversation around the legal definition of it. But essentially, the concept is that the worst harms to nature should be described in a way that is commensurate with the damage that is being done. So, as you can hear from the term, ecocide, it sounds like genocide. It's got that kind of weight to it. And of course, the core activity of our organization, which is rapidly becoming a kind of at the heart of a global movement, is really very simple and precise, and it's to put ecocide alongside genocide, war crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression at the International Criminal Court. In other words, to list serious destruction of nature amongst those acknowledged to be the worst atrocity crimes.
On mute. I still haven't figured out the mute button 2 years into this virtual world that we live in, but I will soon. I know it. I just know it. Okay, great. So one of the things that I've noticed doing a little bit of research on ecocide and is that the language that's used in the definition that I find very interesting is a very similar. It's very similar words as some of the other international legal instruments that touch upon protections for the environment. So the two that I think of first and foremost are the Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions and the Environmental Modification Treaty, which have those long-term, widespread, and severe damage to the environment. And I noticed that ecocide also includes those words. Did you draw upon other instruments within public international law when you were a part of the conversation, or is ecocide, as it pertains to have it criminalized internationally, was that sort of viewed independently?
No, I mean it was very much drawing on previous conventions, as you say. I mean, I think it might be worth giving a little bit of background here, because I mean the term ecocide itself was born back in 1970. I mean, it was used by actually a biologist, Arthur Galston, to describe the awful damage that took place during the Vietnam War as a result of Agent Orange. So it was originally perceived as, if you like, a conflict situation, and it was first used on the international diplomatic stage by the Swedish Prime Minister at the time, Olof Palme. So that was back in 1972 at the first UN Environment Conference, and in fact, recently that's been quite pertinent, because there's been a 50-year commemoration of that conference in Stockholm just a couple of weeks ago, at which we had a really strong presence. So it was kind of effectively, it was a bit of a moment of taking stock and kind of going, well, what actually have we achieved over the last 50 years? And in the case of ecocide, although there was some discussion in the 70s around it, it sort of went into the background, a sort of, I suppose you could say, a sort of legal and political backwater a little bit. What resurfaced in the 90s during the drafting of what was to become the Rome Statute, in other words, the governing document of the International Criminal Court, was that there was intended during that drafting, there was discussion of a clause that would address specifically severe harm to the environment, but that never made the final treaty. And so when my dear departed friend and colleague Polly Higgins started investigating how do we create a legal duty of care for the earth, one of the things that she discovered was that this clause had originally been intended to go into that treaty, and that it hadn't made it. There were certain countries that kind of got in the way of that. Interestingly, all oil states, the US, the UK, France, and the Netherlands. Surprise, surprise. But so what she saw herself as doing, effectively what she dedicated the last 10 years of her life to, was replacing effectively what she saw as a crime that should have been there in the first place. And it's probably worth just taking a moment to kind of pause and think, what world might we be living in now if ecocide had been made an international crime 20 years ago when the ICC opened its doors? And I think that was one of the things that actually drove her sort of, you could almost call it a crusade to get this recognized. And the real milestone, which brings me back to sort of your question, the real milestone in the last year and a half was, in fact, come to think of it, is it the 22nd today?
Yes.
Okay, it is the anniversary of the launch of the legal definition today. So what happened? This is a huge milestone. So there were a number of different people have been working on the idea of ecocide and having a sort of defining it, but that had always been, a lawyer or a group of lawyers saying, I think it should mean this. And Polly was one of those. And, we used her definition as a campaign definition for some years. But what happened in 2020 was we were approached by parliamentarians from the ruling parties in Sweden saying, could you potentially, obviously this is your area of expertise, could you commission a legal definition that could actually be used, that we could practically use, we could take to our government and say, here is a proposition for, for putting a fifth crime into the Rome Statute. And on the basis of that request, we were able to convene a remarkable group of lawyers. So a group of 12 lawyers from around the world with varying legal backgrounds. We had humanitarian lawyers, we had international criminal lawyers, environment and climate lawyers, but also obviously hugely geographically and gender diverse, but also ideologically diverse. So, also ranging from quite conventional, we had an International Law Commission member, we had a former ICC judge, and at the other end we had more kind of activist vibe, if you like, kind of lawyers. So what we could sort of truthfully and honestly say after that drafting process, which took 6 months, is that that group all had to sacrifice something in order to reach consensus on a definition, and that in a sense gave that definition huge credibility, because it really was a genuine consensus. And what was also really remarkable is that working group, if you like, ended up with a definition that was hugely concise and straightforward. And it's, in fact, it's so, the core of it is so concise that it fits on the back of a business card, which is brilliant. It's particularly brilliant when you're dealing with politicians, because they never have time to read through 20 pages of a kind of detailed piece of regulation. But one advantage of criminal law is that, relatively speaking, it tends to be more concise and shorter. And of course, this is hugely concise. And to sort of circle right back to your original question, during that drafting process, which I had the privilege to convene, which meant that for the plenary sessions I was there and I could, I was witnessing these lawyers having these amazing discussions, is that there was a very conscious choice to use language that would be familiar from previous treaties and previous protocols, and the two you mentioned were the really key ones: the Geneva, the Protocol 1, and the ENMOD Convention from the 1970s. And I think this was one of the factors that led to that, was that all of the international crimes that were currently in place were based on effectively crimes that already existed. There was nothing immediate, there was nothing completely new in those crimes. And of course, I mean, so they were sort of 50 years in the kind of in the wings kind of thing, and coming into legislation with the Rome Statute. And I mean, before the 1940s, it was only war crimes that was kind of already established. So, but by the time it came to the Rome Statute, those concepts were already familiar to people. And so with the drafting process for creating a legal definition for ecocide that would be credible and practical to approach governments with, it felt actually quite important to show that although the term itself may feel new, ecocide is still unfamiliar to many people, yet what it describes is actually something that was already condemned in various different contexts, and also in other parts of the Rome Statute itself. So under the war crimes definitions, there's a section which is I believe it's 824B for anyone that wants to look it up. There is a clause that refers to environmental crime during war, and we can talk about that a little bit more in detail if you want to. It's not actually very easy to prosecute, but yeah. So that was quite a conscious decision, and I think also that second threshold that you see in the definition, and actually perhaps I should read the definition out because it's only very short. So ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. And some of the key terms there are, severe, widespread, long-term. That combination is something that would be familiar to those who are familiar with those other conventions. And of course, having that second threshold of it needs to be unlawful or wanton also acknowledges that there are existing bodies of law, and it responds to that. So yeah, I mean, that's a very kind of broad strokes kind of introduction, but I don't want to kind of run on without letting you ask your questions. I have a little bit of a tendency to do that.
That's great. I have that. I have a tendency to do that, and that's great. That was great. And I one of the things that jumps out at me about that definition that everybody agreed on is the word wanton, because I find that so often when the key mental or the key standard is intent, you really can just blow right through that in terms of just creating all sorts of ways in which you're like, oh no, I didn't intend to do it. But if you should have known, if it was so reckless that you should have known that it was going to destroy an ecosystem, then you should probably be held accountable for it. So you talked a lot about sort of how you came into this and how this definition came together. But just real quick before we go on, I was hoping maybe you could speak a little bit about how the actual organization of Stop Ecocide International came about.
Absolutely. So I already gave a little bit of a sense of where Polly was coming from when she was working on this. And she was very much, for many years, she was kind of the name that was associated with ecocide and with the criminalization of it. She sort of brought it back into public consciousness, if you like. And when we first met, I was very much in the sort of sphere of kind of on the ground activism. I was part of the anti-fracking community in the UK. I'd done a lot of research and kind of done talks and leaflets and demonstrations and all of this stuff around that issue. And when Polly moved to the area that I live in, she was at the time working on putting together a case around fracking. And that's how we got introduced. A mutual friend said, well, you need to talk to Jojo about this. She knows loads about it. And we ended up working kind of in parallel for a while, because Polly was obviously, she was a lawyer, she was a barrister. And the way that she sort of portrayed herself, she didn't sort of, she wasn't in the kind of activist arena, if you like. She was sort of more in a kind of establishment sort of law type type vibe, if you like. So for a number of years, we worked alongside. So she would give me legal advice on the campaigning side, and I would give her communications advice on the legal side. And then it came to sort of 2016, 2017. And what we realized at that point, the diplomatic work was already starting to get off the ground, as far as, talking with the climate vulnerable small island states in the Pacific around potentially moving this idea forward of adding Ecocide to the Rome Statute. But foundation funding was not really forthcoming. It was difficult to get funding for. It was seen as a bit left field. It was seen as a bit extreme. But what Polly did have was a large international following, personal following. And at that point, we decided to kind of pitch in together publicly and kind of go, okay, well, let's make this a public campaign. And I effectively crowdfund for the diplomatic work. And that was how it started. And what we realized over time was that actually the two things were more connected than we realized, because actually what we were seeing was that where the conversations were happening, at grassroots or campaigning level, that was also where the political conversations were getting pushed as well. So that was an interesting correlation. And then perhaps, I would say sort of tragically, but perhaps understandably, when Polly departed, there was a huge upsurge in interest. And I think that this is partly because I think sometimes when you have a figure that is very much a pioneer or a figurehead for an initiative, you can end up with a bit of a situation where other people who might be interested kind of sit back a bit and say, well, she's doing that, so I don't need to. And actually what happened when she passed away was that as her closest associate, a lot of people started approaching me saying, well, we really want to see this work go forward. How can we help to do that? And so what emerged was what you could call it a sort of giant, almost global scale dot joining exercise. Because, it turned out that there were, campaigners elsewhere, politicians, lawyers, who were all interested in moving this forward. And so, we've ended up kind of doing a lot of connecting, sort of cross-sector connecting, geographical connecting, and also just kind of realizing that a lot of these people may have been originally inspired by Polly, but there were different groups who were interested around the world, and so that sort of ended up becoming effectively growing into a movement. And I think this is also, there are two other factors that I bring in. One is the kind of ever more apocalyptic sort of consequences of climate change and ecological breakdown that we've been seeing out in the world. That people are kind of beginning to be a real consciousness of, okay, this is a seriously urgent situation. And that, of course, is backed up by the international reports like the IPCC reports, which, please note, they're endorsed by all the governments, and therefore, almost by definition, they're rather conservative. So, when those reports are telling us we have a very few short years to really make a difference here, then that's actually quite a stark and urgent realization. But I think there's another factor as well, which is more looking at the grassroots mobilizations, whether that's the student strikes, the school strikes, led by Greta, the Fridays for Future, but also other kind of on the ground movements, like, for example, Extinction Rebellion or the Sunrise Movement and Stop the Mungumezi in Africa. There's a number across the world, but effectively those movements, we've also seen quite an uprising of popular, effectively raising the alarm around climate and ecological breakdown. And what that's done is it's kind of opened up the media conversation. It's opened up the political conversation. And what it's enabled is for what we had effectively been saying for many years, to finally begin to land and to be sort of visible as, what we've always felt it to be, which is essentially a very common sense solution. Effectively drawing an outer boundary that says, beyond this, thou shalt not go, as a way of creating what you could think of as a kind of a legal safety rail for economic activity. And, so that's kind of, again, a rather broad strokes, but kind of gives you a sense of how the movement has got to the position it's in right now.
Well, thank you. That's great. And I want to just highlight something that you mentioned really both in all of your answers so far, and because one of the reasons that I myself started really getting into the work of Stop Ecocide International and others in the movement to push for accountability for Ecocide is that what you mentioned, that you've really brought in, you had the lawyers and then you had the activists, and you were sort of Polly's bridge to the activists, and Polly was sort of your bridge to the lawyers. And one thing that I was so disheartened by in November when the COP26 happened, and I anticipate it will be similar this time, is that there is a distinct lack of activists. You have the governments, and maybe you even have some very strong action to fight the climate crisis, government officials, but then you have the industry folks, and you don't have the activists. Maybe they get one representative and don't get minimal speaking time, or maybe John Kerry meets with Greta or whoever else. But yeah, you just have a distinct lack of activist presence in these big COP conferences, and that's why I really admire the work of South Ecocide International and other groups that work with it. So you also mentioned sort of something that really stuck with me, which was, can you imagine what it would be like if Ecocide was just added in 1999? And I would add onto that, can you imagine if the United States, who was really considering at that point being a party to the Rome Statute, if not only Ecocide was added, but also the United States became a party? I think those two thought processes could lead me to some very nice places, but then obviously the quick whiplash back to reality would be destructive. So, I got to be careful. We got to be careful with that. But why the Rome Statute? What about the Rome Statute? And maybe while you're talking about this, you can talk a little bit about the detailed strategy that South Ecocide International lays out to get Ecocide included in the Rome Statute. Why the Rome Statute, and maybe a little bit about that strategy, if you can just explain those two things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are potentially many ways that one could take legislating for Ecocide forward, and actually, obviously, we would never discourage anybody from following any other ones. But there are specific reasons why we aim specifically for the ICC. There are probably, there are many, but there are three probably key ones. One is the kind of practical legal consideration of the nature of the ICC and the mechanism that it works with. It's the only global mechanism that directly accesses the criminal justice systems of its member states. It has this complementarity principle. So effectively, if you ratify a crime, if your country ratifies a crime at the ICC, it then has to include it also in its own domestic legislation in the same or very close to the same form. And what that means is that if you want to create a new ground rule that has a coherence across jurisdictional boundaries, then there's actually quite an efficient and effective way to do it. And actually it's quite important, that in itself is important with regard to environmental damage, because often the worst polluters, or the worst culprits, if you like, are transnational corporations. And effectively the damage that is created, and this comes back to the intent thing that you were talking about, it tends to be collateral damage, in the service of another aim, whether that's making money, whether that's, raising cattle, whatever that is, or, dredging the bottom of the ocean, effectively, a lot of those companies do operate in many jurisdictions, and have the ability to potentially, what I call jurisdiction hopping, but people sometimes call forum shopping, where you kind of go from one jurisdiction to another, which has laxer rules. So there's a sort of practicality in that way, that also ties in with the urgency, in the sense that one could, of course, push for national legislation, but there are a couple of, there are some other dangers to that, and that's what, dangers to it exactly, but particular issues, which brings me to the second point. Firstly, you could end up with very different definitions in different places. And that obviously then you have something that's rather piecemeal, and you sort of end up with a little bit the same problem. That actually, I would say that as a risk is lessening, because the definition that came out of the independent expert panel last year was so strong that actually those that are looking at it nationally are looking at it on the basis of the definition that was drafted last year. So that obviously is a positive. But what we also saw, and for example, we saw this as an example in France, is that if you try to legislate domestically, you're going to be up against the fact that domestic legislation can happen quite fast, and that your corporate sector might get a bit worried, and that certain elements of your political spectrum might also get worried. And so whereas if you're aiming for something international, what you're doing is effectively saying there is safety in numbers. You're saying that, because at the ICC, you need at least 2/3 of the member states to be in favor for it to actually be adopted. And that may sound like, a bit of a steep climb, but actually, of course, like the UN, it's a one state, one vote situation. So you don't necessarily even need the biggest economies for that to move forward. But the key point that I'm kind of trying to make here is that it's politically cheaper to support at the international level. If you can be seen as a leader, hey, we support an international crime of ecocide, you know, that's a really strong statement for a government to make, but they don't have to act immediately. So that, you know, and they also know that they don't have to act until other people are acting with them. And that's actually very important, because then they don't feel like they're going out on a limb, they don't feel like they're losing competitive edge or anything like that. But the other aspect to this is that the time lapse, and obviously it takes some time for negotiations to take place, for the momentum to gather. The importance of that, and of course we don't want it to be too long because we don't have too long, but some, you know, an interval is important, and it's important because then people can see it coming. And actually, while often what people talk about is, you know, what will happen when this comes into practice, how will it be prosecuted, what will it be like when it's in place, and we keep saying to people, actually, you've got to realize that the strategic window for change is actually before the law comes into place. It's actually literally between right now when you're hearing about it and, you know, when that comes into place, because that is your window where you're going to have your investors, your insurers, your CEOs and your boards of directors kind of going, okay, we can see this coming. What does that mean for us? And of course, what we want them to be doing is to kind of, you know, pick up this definition, and short as it is, and kind of go, okay, here's our lens. You know, what does our sector look like through this lens, and what are the questions we need to ask? And of course, as soon as you get people asking those the right questions, they're going to start finding the answers. But right now, they're not asking the questions. So, you know, so there's actually a huge potential there in that sort of window between people seeing it coming and its arrival, if you like. And then finally, to come to the sort of third aspect of why the ICC is so important, is that even though some of the biggest polluters like the US, like China, like Russia, are not actually members of the ICC, they never ratified the statute, nonetheless, there is a global awareness that what the ICC has jurisdiction over are the very worst crimes. So there's a very strong kind of moral mandate that it has, even, you know, given the fact that the whole world isn't a member. And so what you see there is the importance of putting environmental destruction alongside destruction of people. And this is bearing in mind that our legal system has grown up over centuries to be entirely anthropocentric. I mean, understandably so, perhaps. Also, you know, given a very, very long history of, you know, humans, particularly in the dominant global paradigm, which is Western and comes from the Western canon, of seeing ourselves as the lords and masters of nature, seeing ourselves as separate from, seeing ourselves as, you know, treating nature as a bank of resources. You know, all of that has led logically to the system that we have, but the system that we have is very exclusively focused around people and property. And so when you put ecocide alongside genocide and crimes against humanity, what you're saying, I mean, it's quite a sort of it's almost an acupunctural, quite a strategic move to do that. And you could simply say it's just adding a crime to a list of crimes. You know, it's not, you know, shaking up the entire, you know, legal system. But so in that level, you could say it's quite subtle, but it also has quite a profound rebalancing effect. It has a profound effect on how we consider our relationship to nature, because, you know, ultimately, of course, we're deeply dependent on nature. We can't eat, we can't drink, we can't breathe unless we have healthy ecosystems. And so, you know, while, you know, one could say that the intent is very different to, say, genocide, where genocide is defined as, you know, an act with the intention to destroy a people in whole or in part. And as we've already touched on, it's just not like that with ecocide. But when you look at the consequences and you look at the potential dangers, you can see very easily why it belongs there with the worst crimes, and why putting it there could actually have a really strong normative effect. And you know, I mean, certainly from my personal perspective, I think that, you know, over the long term, that may prove to be the most profound effect.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you said a couple of buzzwords in there that I want to focus in on and maybe get to in a moment, particularly anthropocentric, which and the sort of the person, the humanity focused way in which we go about in a lot of mainstream conversations about protections for the environment, ecocide in particular, versus sort of the biocentric or ecocentric, which is just so protecting nature so humans can live, as opposed to protecting nature because, I mean, we should just protect nature. So like I wanted to, and another thing I wanted to get just that I thought was really interesting when you talk about how, you can relate ecocide to genocide, and in ways that can be somewhat indistinguishable and greatly profound. And I think something that I find interesting, and I've been thinking about and trying to wrap my head around it, is that in some ways it's impossible to distinguish that, particularly as it pertains to indigenous communities. And ecocide can literally be genocide, because at the very least cultural genocide, and all the way into like full-on genocide. So when you consider how where indigenous communities are, particularly Brazil and United States and Canada, Australia, and all around the world. So I wanted to touch upon anthropocentric versus biocentric. When I see these conversations happening, I'm encouraged to see that they're almost always friendly. I haven't seen like a really heated debate about, or not debate, a really heated argument over whether we should protect the environment because it's important to protect humans, or important to protect the environment just for itself. But even so, there is in the conversation somewhat of a binary. Do you think that's a useful binary, or do you think that it really they should be distinct but thought of as sort of interacting with one another?
I had to say I'm more in the interacting sphere. I mean, I can understand why that dichotomy has been sort of put out there, because it's a way of, effectively of trying to kind of rebalance something that feels out of balance, and that often does lead to a bit of polarization. But as you say, I mean, they don't tend to be sort of totally sort of outright arguments. I know of a few that sort of, there are a few people that, for example, don't think that this definition is ecocentric enough, for example. And of course, our response to that is that, all the crimes that currently exist at the ICC are all anthropocentric. And if you were to actually go totally ecocentric, I mean, there's no way on this earth you would actually get any kind of approach of, I mean, no politician's going to take it seriously. So, there's a way in which, this definition, it stretches what's currently there, and effectively, it doesn't depend on human harm to actually make out the crime. So on that level, there is a level of ecocentricity, and I think that is very important. But you could argue, as you say, that it may be, we may consider it important because we have some kind of realization that our own survival depends on it. There is that. I mean, that said, I think it's really interesting and important what you mentioned about the indigenous cultures, because they simply do not perceive that dichotomy. I mean, they do sometimes talk in those terms, to the world at large in order to kind of make points. But I think that, I mean, what was interesting when we first convened the drafting panel, we put out a public consultation. We had hundreds of responses from a whole range of people, from activists, academics, and NGOs, and but we also convened a small group of indigenous voices from around the world, one from each continent. And what was really striking was that the word nature wasn't even used in those conversations. It was all, I mean, Mother Earth was used a bit, but it was all came down to kind of cultural practices, because actually there's ultimately we are all parts of, the biosphere, if you like. So there's a way in which drawing that distinction is not always helpful. I mean, I think there probably are instances where, it makes a point, in the sense that, that there is this way of sort of pointing out the hubris of humanity in terms of, the way that we sort of treat, other, not just nature, but actually, and again, I suppose this again sort of mixes it up a little bit. Effectively, we have a situation where a relatively small number of, wealthy and powerful people treat both nature and other people as resources. And that's where you also start ending up looking at the discourse with the difference between the wealthy North and the global South and developing countries, or potentially poorer communities in the North as well, and looking at actually how people are treated as resources, and so how it does really, it really does cross over into human rights, and as you say, there are instances where you really are talking about genocide, but there's another and all sort of cultural genocide. But I think that there is another aspect to that, of course, with the indigenous, where the river, the mountain, the forest are actually considered relatives. They're not. You actually are killing their family, if you're damaging a river, for example. So one could argue that I mean, there are so many, there's such a plurality of ways of understanding the world. And, one of the lessons in this, and this came up really interestingly, actually, in a conference I've literally just been in Italy, where somebody was talking about rights of nature. And there's a big movement internationally to give legal personhood to rivers, to landscape features, and ultimately perhaps have the whole legal system acknowledge that nature, has intrinsic rights. But what was very interesting, there was one contributor to this conference that was saying, well, even that is actually an anthropocentric sort of conceit in a way, because you're ending up having, for example, somebody in court to represent the river. What if the river were to represent itself? Obviously, this can go off into some quite interesting tangents. But one point that made me think of is, let's say you're talking about a polluted river. What if you didn't hold that trial in a courtroom, but you actually held it at the river, so that the river was literally speaking for itself? And actually, interestingly, there are rivers that are absolutely filled with trash from our culture that's been shipped out to other places, where, literally rivers of trash. Now, imagine if you held that trial by that river. I can imagine that the judgments that might come out of that might be very, very different. So, so there's some really, really interesting kind of, elements that can come into this. But of course, from our perspective, making ecocide an international crime is we're not trying to go that far out. What we're trying to do is create the possibility of, new approaches by effectively inserting a piece into a system that interacts with that system, but that starts to kind of open up new possibilities and starts to create levels of protection that we don't currently have. One of the ways that we think about it is, if you like, a criminal version of a health and safety law. When it comes to environmental regulation, companies are very used to employing expensive lawyers to work around regulation, and often the first question is, well, how will I know exactly whether I'm committing ecocide? How exactly, where is that line? And of course, if you think about it in terms of health and safety, you don't think of it like that. No factory is going to say, how do we nearly break someone's head open but not quite? They're actually going to think about, how do we avoid breaking someone's head open? And that, of course, is the approach that we're looking for with this.
Right. Okay. That's really interesting. And that actually, because I like to think of myself as somebody who does a lot of research in this space. I like to think of myself as somebody who's like thought through this stuff with the rights of nature and everything. But the whole idea that even having somebody represent a river or a plant, a type of plant. There's a really interesting case out of Minnesota in a tribal court where a type of rice was represented, and even that is anthropocentric. And then the thought of the whatever natural element is representing itself, that blows my mind. That's a concept I didn't even consider. And speaking somewhat selfishly, as a lawyer, I don't need any more competition, but I will I will accept it because it's a cool idea and I love it. So I wanted to get into rights of nature a little bit, but you just covered that a little. I know that Ecuador is like sort of on the front end of that in terms of canonizing it in their national laws. But I would love to sort of venture into armed conflict a little bit. So one of the narratives that you hear when you're sort of doing research or just watching the news is the major global threats of geopolitical threats of the 2020s is COVID, climate change, and conflict. And obviously, COVID and climate or the environment, those are very related things in terms of pushing animals that might be disease carrying closer to human populations, and I don't want to discount that, but right now I want to focus on the climate and conflict. In the news right now, we're seeing all the things that are going on in Ukraine, particularly with global food supply and nuclear facilities being handled irresponsibly, and then you have other places like Yemen, where and I hope you can speak to this maybe specifically because it's been blowing my mind, the news about this this oil tanker off the coast of Yemen, where it seems like the international community only needs to come up with $20 million to make this thing safe, and yet somehow like 4 times the amount of oil as the Exxon Valdez is about to spill on the coast of this country that already is in such dire conditions. Like I don't get it. I just don't get it. But how does armed conflict and the laws that currently exist protecting the environment during armed conflict, if there, I mean, there are, but if they're sufficient at all, how does that work in terms of ecocide, and how do you suggest we make progress on protecting ecosystems during armed conflict?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I mean, I have to say it's not my area of speciality, but it's certainly come to the fore a lot in recent months because of the Ukraine situation, of course. And I have to say I'm completely with you on the Yemen oil tanker thing. I mean, it's just insane, completely insane. And I mean, of course, there's sort of two aspects. One is that, you know, ecocide it can be a cause of conflict, and actually, I mean, if you could extrapolate with the kind of extractive oil industry, and you could actually even, you know, potentially work that into the whole matrix of how the Ukraine situation has arisen. But certainly there are places in the world where that has been, you know, quite acutely the case, whether that's in Sudan or you know, potentially you know, you're kind of looking at things like droughts and problems with harvests and these kinds of things actually fueling, and resource depletion and so on, fueling conflict. So you can see it as a sort of cause aspect. But then obviously, as in the Ukraine situation, you can also see it as an effect, and even potentially as a method in some cases. I mean, what's interesting about Ukraine is that, you know, we almost kind of, it's actually, we can't kind of point at Ukraine and say that's why we need a law of ecocide in a very direct way, simply because weirdly, I mean, Ukraine and Russia both actually have ecocide in their penal codes already. It's not necessarily as strong as an international crime might be, but clearly, you know, that hasn't prevented it happening. But there is some discussion of, you know, I mean, certainly the Ukraine chief prosecutor is wanting to, you know, follow a potential course of, you know, accusing Russia of ecocide. But I think that there is an inadequacy in the current provisions for under war crimes. I mean, there is, as I say, there is this clause that does include severe, widespread and long-term destruction of the environment during wartime is a war crime. But it has this kind of, it's very difficult to prosecute because it has this balancing aspect in it where the damage has to be out of proportion to the military advantage anticipated. Now, of course, the rather obvious problem with that is that it comes down to the perpetrator to actually describe what their military advantage anticipated was, and which makes it virtually impossible to prosecute. So there is clearly a gap there. And what we would obviously say in relation to that is that, yes, war is one of the worst culprits in terms of creating ecocide. But obviously, ecocide is happening in many different forms during peacetime all the time. And so effectively, what that does provide an argument for is saying, well, actually, there is a missing law here that could be used in times of peace or conflict, and which could be more clear cut than, you know, even necessarily than some of the war crimes, or even possibly crime of aggression. But I mean, I don't know enough about that particular area to go into that in depth. But it would certainly supplement, and usefully supplement, the sort of regulations that are there, or regulations are the wrong word, but the rules that are there around armed conflict. I mean, I'm not sure how specifically well I've answered that question, but I think in broad strokes, hopefully, it gives you a bit of a sense of what our position is on that. And we are also aware that there are investigations going on in, you know, precisely in the Ukraine situation to see, you know, to explore what current avenues could be used. And, you know, I suspect that it is likely to come up, you know, from our perspective, it will come up with a situation where it would be so much easier if there were an ecocide specific law in place.
Right. One thing that comes to mind for me when I think about the laws of armed conflict and ecocide and the definition of ecocide, I again come back to that term wanton, because I think when you're doing an analysis of whether there's a lawful attack that's going to potentially destroy an ecosystem, when you use the term wanton, there's the four principles of proportionality, distinction, military necessity, and provision of unnecessary weapons that cause unnecessary suffering. But So distinction, when you think of distinction and proportionality, distinction, you're prohibited from targeting an ecosystem. Okay, well, that's easy to just sort of like say, we didn't target it, it just was there. But when you add wanton in there, it affects the proportionality analysis. It's like, okay, well, were you reckless in targeting this target? But you know, so that's just sort of how that just sort of came to mind while you're giving that excellent explanation. So I want to ask one more question, and then I want to get to audience questions, a couple if we have time. I was going to ask about accountability, but there is an audience question about that. While you're giving the answer to this last one, I was wondering if one of my colleagues who's helping monitor things can put the link for Stop Ecocide International for the website in the chat so people can visit. Oh, okay, well, there we go. For the last question that I'm going to ask, it's the weirdest balance when talking about the climate crisis, where you need to feel urgency, you need to feel some level of dread, but you can't lose hope. And so we sort of talked about all the devastating effects that ecocide can have. What gives you hope in this time?
Well, I think it has to be the fact that it feels very much like, I don't know, the world is beginning to kind of wake up to something really serious needing to be done. And there is a kind of bittersweet aspect to it, because obviously the worse things get in the world, the more people listen to us. So we're kind of a little bit in this, like, you know, do we celebrate? Do we grieve? You know, it's kind of both at the same time in a way. But what I would say is that, I mean, we recently had a piece of research granted to us as a part of one of our funders gave it to us. And they had this whole this communications company do a public survey. And that was actually based in the UK, but it gave a kind of an indicator for a wealthy nation and what that response might be. And what was really interesting was that over 50% of people that had never heard the word before and that, you know, just knew nothing about it, when they first heard about it and what we were saying about it, instantly agreed that it should be a crime. Now, what was interesting about that is the communications company came back to us and said, my God, you know, most of our clients would give their right arm to have initial results like you were getting. So what that kind of, you know, in a sense, what gives me hope around that is that conversation, it is growing fast. It's got a lot further to spread, but there is a kind of very much a kind of there's beginning to be, I think, a real sort of no-brainer feel to putting this law in place. And you know, while nothing is a silver bullet, and we do sometimes get people, you know, wanting, you know, sort of latching on to this law as a possible, you know, way to solve everything. And obviously, I mean, I don't believe that there's anything that can fix everything. At the same time, I have to say, it's going to be quite difficult to fix anything until we put this piece in place. You know, we're going to be continuing to operate on a void until this thing is in place. So what gives me hope is the fact that actually we kind of know that as soon as people hear about it, they actually support it, and that is really encouraging. And what it kind of means is that in a way, it's simply a question of reach. So, you know, everyone watching this, listening to this, go talk about it to your friends, because, you know, this is, I really think we're at a moment now. And this is why things have been sort of accelerating so fast. I mean, put it this way, before the definition came out, I was still able to read every email that came into my inbox. That is long gone. That time is long gone, you know, because there is so much interest in this. And, you know, we now have over 20 countries, which are member states of the ICC, talking about this, and they've got it on public record at parliament level, at government level, and that very much gives me hope, because it shows that, you know, even the politicians who are frankly always the last to the party, you know, are starting to really kind of you know, get on board with this conversation.
Yes. Okay, that's great, and I feel even more hopeful than I did before. So thank you, just personally. Okay, so we have a question from the audience that really touches on accountability. And so with genocide, this person writes, with genocide, it's easy to identify the perpetrator. How do you identify perpetrators in the context of ecocide when thinking about accountability?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And it's the first thing to say about it is that the ICC crimes are aimed at individuals. So yes, you are looking for a perpetrator, or potentially more than one. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be only one person. But you are also, in a sense, you're looking for the source. You're trying to go to the source. So as with genocide, you're not prosecuting the foot soldiers. You're looking for the controlling minds. So it's likely to be, I mean, a corporate officer of some kind. It could be directors who signing off on a major extractive project, for example. It could even potentially be, a government minister, or even let's put it out there, could even be a head of state signing a policy into action that they know is going to create severe harm. And so so there's that's the kind of direction of travel, is kind of upstream as far as possible. It's not, I mean, with environmental destruction, it's not necessarily as simple to investigate as, I mean, I guess, if you've got a dead body, you've got a dead body, and you can go work out the details of that. If you've got a destroyed ecosystem, you could potentially have a whole range of things. But one of the key aspects of this definition in particular, and I think why it's potentially so powerful, is that it's framed as a crime of endangerment. So what you're actually hopefully not going to be doing is waiting till half the planet's destroyed and then working your way back to find out who's at fault. What you're actually doing is you're creating preemptive accountability, because what you're saying is, pause with your pen over the dotted line, because the act that is the crime is the act that threatens the severe harm. It's not the harm itself. Just in the same way as directing an attack at a civilian population is a crime, regardless of what happens to that population. So there's a well-established precedence for phrasing things in this way. And it's actually really important because, I mean, just to give a small example, there was a study done in, I think it was Colorado University a few years ago, where they looked at how corporate behavior changed in regard to legislation changing. And what they found, that if you changed environmental regulation, you changed corporate budgeting. Whereas if you brought in a criminal element, you started to change behavior. And so I think what we're looking at here is the fact that, if your personal freedom and reputation are on the line, then that's going to give you a lot more pause than a big fine for your company, which it may well have budgeted for anyway. And of course, there is the knock-on effect that, which is different perhaps to say war crimes or genocide, where perhaps those perpetrators aren't particularly focused on their public relations. But with, in the corporate world, they very much are. So, if the CEO of a company has a tap on the shoulder, and maybe even if they're not ultimately found to be guilty, if they're put in a position where they could be seen as a criminal, what's going to happen to the stock value of that company? It's going to be a pretty fast response. So what that does is it creates a level of, as I say, preemptive accountability, where there's a kind of pause for thought. There's a concentration of the mind. There's a kind of, as I say, there's the potential of actually using that definition as a lens through which to look at decisions you're about to make.
Well, as I can say, as a proud graduate of the University of Colorado, I wholly endorse that study, and I know that it was done with the utmost rigor. But thank you for that. Thank you for that explanation, or for that answer. See if we have any more.
I can see someone in the chat is taking it would take huge resources to bring it up to the level of the ICC and huge evidence. Yes, you're right, but of course there is something else about the ecocide as a crime in relation to the other crimes, which is quite interesting, which is that if you're a war criminal or a génocidaire, the likelihood of you being prosecuted in your home country is relatively small. So you're kind of almost by default going to end up with a situation at the ICC, which, as we know, is a bit slow and not hugely, doesn't have a reputation for hugely effective prosecution. But with ecocide, it's different, because ecocide could be prosecuted anywhere that it's ratified. And because it's not at the level of, necessarily, I mean, there may be some exceptions that we could all think of, but it's not necessarily at the level of a head of state, but at the level of a corporate officer. There is far more potential for prosecution elsewhere, as you say, as this person says, in regional or national jurisdictions.
Oh, great. Well, we are nearly out of time. Before we go, there's somebody wanted to know, where can we get copies of the small card with the definitions that you showed?
Oh, bless you. Do you know what? I think that's the first time somebody's actually asked us for that, as in to have some of those. But we do have them, and we do. What we should do. Thank you for the prompt. Is we should make that available on our print resources, because we've got, so at the moment we've got leaflets up there and we've got placards up there, which is more sort of obviously focused more at the activist end. But actually, at the end of having something nice in your pocket that you can literally just hand to somebody, I think you're absolutely right. What we should do is put them up there as, you know, to be printed, because actually most people can find quite cheap printing of business cards, and that's certainly a lot cheaper than using UPS to ship them around the world. But yeah, so thank you for that, and we will load them up there.
Oh, okay, all right. So you heard it here first. The American Red Cross event for Ecocide International's cards. They're coming at you. Okay, well, I think we're coming to the end here. Let's see if there was one other question that I saw that I thought was very interesting. Let me just check here. Some have argued that crimes like terrorism and drug trafficking were rejected when negotiating the Rome Statute because the parties wanted to focus on crimes typically committed by state leaders and high-ranking officials that the domestic system wouldn't touch. Ecocide mainly targeting, if it does mainly target corporations, what makes Ecocide a better fit? You kind of touched on this now that I'm really thinking about it, but if you have anything else to say about
what makes it a better fit at the international crime level. Yeah, I mean, I think one aspect which I already talked about was the consequences and how serious they are for the international community as a whole. So there is that. There is also another element that comes into that, though, which is that, you know, there are some countries where often developing countries, I mean, some South American countries come to mind, but, you know, where the national legal situation is either corrupt or not strong enough or difficult to enforce, and having for those who are operating on the ground and wanting to have a legal tool that can at least be, you know, kind of held over the heads of corporate actors, for example, or even state actors, is having that extra level of the ICC, which can prosecute at that top level, is actually hugely supportive. I mean, for example, we think about how many environmental defenders go missing in some countries around the world. I mean, you know, it's become quite serious in recent years. And part of the issue, and we see this in a minor way with climate activism in the wealthy countries, but, you know, those who are trying to stand up to protect their land and their ancestral territories, or the ecosystems, are often framed as criminals who are interrupting legitimate business. Now, as soon as you put a question mark over that business as to whether it's legitimate, even if it's, you know, ultimately doesn't lead to a prosecution, what you're doing in terms of framing is very powerful, because what you're saying is that actually those who might be the criminals are actually those who are carrying out the damage, you know, which is kind of the way it should be. You know, whereas those who are standing up to protect are then seen as the moral upholders of the law. There's a totally different kind of moral position that emerges from that. So that's another reason, I think, why it's useful for it to be at the international crime level.
Yeah, yes. One of the many reasons, and you mentioned the campaign, the two stories that have been making me just going nuts while I listen to them in the news right now is, I mean, amongst the many, but is the oil tanker in Yemen, but also these folks who went missing in Brazil.
Yeah,
It's horrible, sickening, and something about it. It feels like there's a lot of information that we don't know. So we'll see what happens. Jojo,
yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much for this. It was like I have followed your work for some time now, and it's inspiring, and it's so interesting, and it's so important, and I love reading about it and the work that you do. Stop Ecocide International does incredible work. It's making progress on an exponentially increasing way on getting this horrible practice included in the International Criminal Court statute. And thank you so much for coming to talk with us today.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a delight to speak with you, and thanks everybody for coming along. It's been great.
Yes, thank you. And I wanted to also thank my colleagues for helping me out behind the scenes, and thank you to the audience for coming. This is so important. It's so important that people come and listen to this stuff. So thank you all, and
go talk about Ecocide.
Go tell people about it. All right, bye everybody.
Thanks so much.